So let's talk about salicylate toxicity. Salicylate toxicity. Okay, we are going to talk about clinical manifestations, diagnosis and management. So it inhibits cyclooxygenase, resulting in decreased synthesis of prostaglandin, prostacyclins and thromboxanes, and stimulation of chemoreceptor trigger zone in the medulla causes nausea, vomiting. Okay, activation of respiratory center of medulla results in increased respiratory rate and respiratory alkalosis, and inhibition of cellular metabolism. Okay, causes metabolic acidosis. Cellular metabolism causes metabolic acidosis, hyperthermia. Okay, uncoupling of Krebs cycle, uncoupling of reaction that causes hyperthermia. Yes, I think in electron transportation it uncouples, and then instead of producing ATP, heat is produced, and that is the mechanism of hyperthermia. So early symptoms include tinnitus, vertigo, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and subsequent symptoms portending a more severe intoxication includes altered mental status, ranging from agitation to lethargy, and hyperthermia, non-cardiac pulmonary edema, and coma. But various factors can affect symptom onset, such as multiple aspirin ingestion separated in time, ingestion of enteric-coated preparations, and co-ingestants. Therefore, neither the diagnosis of aspirin toxicity nor an estimation of overdose severity should be based upon the timing of symptoms and signs. Fatal aspiration and intoxication can occur after ingestion of 10 to 30 gram by adults and as little as 3 gram by children. Although toxicity does not correlate completely with serum salicylate concentration and symptoms, most patients exhibit signs of intoxication when serum level exceeds greater than 40 to 50 mg per deciliter. Okay, and hyperpnea is often observed in salicylate overdose and is an early clinical finding that helps establish the diagnosis. Clinicians should therefore pay particular attention not only to the rate but also to the depth of respiratory rate. Salicylate stimulates medullary respiratory center causing tachypnea and hyperventilation. In addition, salicylates uncouple oxidative phosphorylation in the mitochondria. This generates heat and increases body temperature. However, lack of hyperthermia should not be used to exclude the diagnosis of salicylate toxicity. Patients may also develop tachycardia due to hypovolemia, agitation, and general distress. Okay, and salicylates commonly cause tinnitus even at concentration within therapeutic range. Okay, like 20 mg per deciliter. These symptoms should be specifically sought in all patients with potential aspirin toxicity. Tinnitus generally resolves with acute salicylate toxicity and no further workup is required. Okay, and aspirin can cause nausea, vomiting through multiple mechanisms like direct irritation of gastric mucosa, decreased production of prostaglandins leading to deterioration of protective mucosal barrier. Okay, and direct stimulation of chemoreceptor trigger zone in the medulla. Vomiting can be severe and contribute to volume loss. Hemorrhagic gastritis, blood-tinged vomitus, and hematemesis have been described but are far less common. Okay, a variety of acid-base abnormalities with salicylate intoxication can occur. Salicylate stimulates respiratory center directly, resulting in fall in PCO2 and respiratory alkalosis. An anion gap metabolic acidosis then follows due primarily to accumulation of organic acids including lactic acid, ketoacids. Salicylate acid itself has only a minor effect on serum pH. since a serum level of 50 mg per deciliter represent a concentration that is less than 3 milliequivalent per liter. Okay. Onset of metabolic derangements depends upon the amount and type of aspirin ingested, whether ingestion is acute or chronic, the presence of co-ingestants, and whether pylorospasm or Bezoar formation has occurred. And net effect of these changes is that most adults have either primary respiratory alkalosis or more commonly mixed primary respiratory alkalosis and primary metabolic acidosis. Okay, a pure primary metabolic acidosis is unusual in adults, but may be seen in children who are brought to medical care soon after ingestion. Okay, acute respiratory acidosis is rare in early stage of aspirin toxicity, but it may occur in later stage of profound poisoning. Respiratory acidosis that occurs early in the course of aspirin poisoning suggests co-ingestion with respiratory depressant. Approximately 1/3 of adults who intentionally overdose on aspirin also ingest one or more other medications, many of which are respiratory depressants. Salicylic acid is a weak acid that exists in charged, deprotonated and uncharged, means protonated forms. The uncharged molecule can easily cross cell barriers. So salicylic acid, which is uncharged molecule, can easily cross cellular membranes including blood-brain barrier and epithelial of renal tubule. This causes increase in salicylate concentration in the central nervous system, which correlates with lethality, and increase in the amount of salicylate absorbed from renal collecting system. Metabolic acidosis increases the fraction of uncharged molecules, which exacerbates toxicity. Okay, so if there is acidosis, the fraction of uncharged protonated molecules increases. Okay, and which exacerbates toxicity. Treatment of salicylate intoxication is directed towards decreasing the fraction of uncharged, means protonated form, which is accomplished by increasing the systemic pH, lowering H+ concentration. This is referred to as alkalinization, and is most easily accomplished by administering sodium bicarbonate. Increasing the systemic pH reduces the diffusion of salicylate ions into the central nervous system, as charged molecules do not easily diffuse across the blood-brain barrier. Okay, alkalinization also traps salicylate ions within the renal tubules, preventing back diffusion across the renal epithelium into the systemic circulation. And salicylate poisoning produces alteration in mental status through 3 mechanisms: direct toxicity in the central nervous system, neuroglycopenia, okay, cerebral edema. So these are 3 mechanisms: direct toxicity to the central nervous system, neuroglycopenia and cerebral edema. Progressive acidosis promotes the influx of salicylic acidosis into the central nervous system, and acidemia increases the likelihood of changes in mental status, with the most common finding being agitation, confusion and restlessness. Okay, coma is rare. Lethargy develops as patients' metabolic derangement worsen and they start to fatigue. Seizures may occur, and it remains unclear whether they are often due to direct salicylate toxicity or neuroglycopenia. Salicylates lower CNS glucose concentration. Okay, therefore neuroglycopenia may occur despite normal serum glucose. Okay, mortality from salicylate poisoning correlates closely with CNS salicylate concentration. An altered mental status due to salicylate toxicity is an absolute indication for hemodialysis. And salicylate induced non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema and acute lung injury generally occur in older patients with chronic salicylate intoxication, but they should be considered in all patients presenting with salicylate toxicity. Salicylate-induced acute lung injury and pulmonary edema can complicate volume resuscitation and administration of sodium bicarbonate, two mainstay of treatment in this setting. Okay, thus the presence of salicylate-induced pulmonary edema is an absolute indication for hemodialysis. And salicylate poisoning most commonly causes sinus tachycardia, but ventricular arrhythmia have been described as a pre-terminal event, and fluid and electrolyte shift are the most common cause, although salicylates can directly alter the membrane permeability of cardiac myocytes. Fluid loss associated with salicylate overdose can be significant, like 4 to 6 liter per square meter body, okay, and are caused by hyperthermia, hyperpnea, okay, lack of food and drink, and osmotic diuresis, other vomiting. Okay, so these are the mechanism of fluid loss from the body, and this causes reflex tachycardia. And salicylate can cause thrombocytopenia, capillary fragility, and decreased platelet adhesions. These abnormalities are not of clinical significance. Okay, and liver injury from salicylate poisoning can lead to decreased glycogen production, increased lactate production, although hepatitis has been described in adults. So diagnostic testing, what labs order we do, and okay, and then we will discuss about management. Okay, so let's talk about diagnostic testing. Serum salicylate. So therapeutic serum salicylate concentration fall between 10 to 30 mg per deciliter. Value above 40 mg per deciliter are associated with toxicity. Okay, although toxicity does not correlate exactly with serum salicylate concentration and symptoms, most patients exhibit signs of intoxication when the serum concentration exceeds 40 to 50. Fatal aspiration intoxication can occur after ingestion of 10 to 30 gram by adults and as little as 3 gram by children. Okay, as I have already told you. In patients with clinical signs of salicylate poisoning, serum concentration should be measured every 2 hours. Every 2 hours until 2 consecutive levels of continuing decrease from the peak measurement. The most recent concentrations fall below 40 mg per deciliter and the patient is asymptomatic with normal respiratory rate and effort. Note that concentration might not begin to rise until 5 to or 6 hours after ingestion because of the pylorospasm, bezoar formation or use of enteric coated tablets, and may rarely peak as late as 35 hours after ingestion. So monitoring serum salicylate concentration may help assess the response to therapy and determine the need for more aggressive measures including hemodialysis. Okay, and levels above 100 mg per deciliter are associated with increased morbidity and mortality and are considered absolute indication for hemodialysis. Okay, and aspirin is eliminated almost exclusively through kidney. So serum creatinine concentration should be checked in all patients who present with known or suspected salicylate toxicity. Renal failure is an absolute indication for hemodialysis, and if there is renal failure, it can't excrete, and therefore it is absolute indication. Okay, hemodialysis should be done in case of renal failure, and mild renal impairment is relative indication for hemodialysis and must be interpreted in light of the patient's overall clinical conditions. And hypokalemia, if present, must be treated aggressively. Hypokalemia promotes absorption of potassium in the distal tubule, and this absorption occurs through potassium hydrogen exchange pump, and the secretion of protons involved in these pumps interfere with the efforts of at urinary alkalinization, which are the mainstay of therapy. Did you understand or not? I am again repeating. Hypokalemia, if present, must be treated aggressively. Hypokalemia promotes absorption of the potassium in the distal tubule. Okay, there is sodium, I mean to say that potassium hydrogen exchange. Okay, do you know potassium hydrogen exchange pump in distal tubule, and the secretion of protons involved in this pump interferes with efforts at urinary alkalinization. I'm sorry, it is opposite, like this. Let's say this is tubular lumen side and this is blood side. Okay, and it is potassium hydrogen is secreted, potassium is absorbed, and if there is a hypokalemia, then what happens? more and more potassium begins to absorb, and consequently hydrogen is secreted. So here H plus is more secreted, and if salicylate ion comes here, it binds, and salicylic acid, which is uncharged form, gets absorbed easily. That's why hypokalemia should be treated aggressively. Okay, did you understand or not? The secretion of protons involved in this pump interferes with efforts at urinary alkalinization, which are mainstay of therapy, because we are trying to maintain alkalinization and in this side, in the urinary side. Okay, so let's say this is distal tubular cell and this is blood side. Okay, and this is urine side. So we are trying to maintain alkalinization on this side, and if there is hypokalemia, then potassium is more absorbed. Okay, and when potassium is more absorbed, then H plus is more secreted. Then instead of alkalinization, what is being done? Acidosis is done, and in acidotic conditions, these uncharged salicylate ions combine with H plus and then forms uncharged salicylic acid, and uncharged salicylic acid is easily absorbed through cell membranes, which further contributes to salicylate toxicity. Rarely, large salicylate overdose may cause hepatotoxicity and interfere with vitamin K metabolism, leading to coagulopathy, which manifests as elevation in prothrombin time and INR. Salicylates uncouple oxidative phosphorylation, which results in abnormal cellular energy production and utilization. The cell becomes dependent upon anaerobic metabolism, resulting in accumulation of lactate. Thus, a significant salicylate poisoning will lead to elevated serum lactate concentration. An anion gap is generally elevated in the setting of salicylate toxicity. However, there are case reports of patients with normal anion gap despite severe intoxication, and clinicians should not be dissuaded from making the diagnosis because the anion gap is not elevated. In patients with clinical signs of severe salicylate poisoning, important treatment interventions like hemodialysis should not be delayed in order to obtain imaging studies. The need for imaging with head CT depends upon the clinical picture, but imaging should be performed in any patients with altered mental status or focal neurological deficits that are not clearly attributable to non-cerebral causes like hypoglycemia. Okay, and chest x-ray should be obtained if there are clinical signs of pulmonary edema. Okay, so now we are going to talk about chronic salicylate poisoning. It is generally seen in young children or elderly as a result of excessive therapeutic administration of products containing salicylates. Okay, chronic salicylate poisoning can be difficult to diagnose, in part because there is no clear history of ingestion. Clinical findings in chronic and acute salicylate poisoning overlap, but classic symptoms and signs may be milder or absent with chronic toxicity and are often attributed to other disease process. As an example, difficulty breathing and pulmonary edema in elderly patients is often attributed to cardiac or pulmonary illness. Another problem is that many of the signs and symptoms of chronic poisoning may be attributed to the element that was being treated with salicylates. The delays in diagnosis caused by these difficulties result in higher overall morbidity and mortality. The management of chronic salicylate poisoning does not differ significantly from acute overdose. However, a lower salicylate concentration is generally used as a threshold for treatment with hemodialysis. In fact, some patients with signs of severe chronic toxicity may have salicylate concentration within therapeutic range. Hemodialysis is often needed and should be discussed with medical toxicologists and nephrologists for any patient who has therapeutic or elevated salicylate concentration and any of the symptoms like CNS dysfunctions like deliriums, lethargy, seizures, renal failure, pulmonary edema, or severe acid bases or electrolyte abnormalities with no alternative explanation. Now we are going to talk about management. So as with all poisoned patient, treatment consists of rapid stabilization of the airway, breathing, circulation. Okay, and this would be followed by gastrointestinal decontamination if indicated, and the initiation of specific therapies designed to mitigate the effects of toxin, which in case of aspirin consists of alkalinization of the plasma and urine, and in some cases hemodialysis. Okay, so Tracheal intubation of the aspirin poisoned patient is dangerous. So intubation, don't do intubation. Should be reserved for cases of respiratory failure. Intubation of tachypneic patients to prevent physical exhaustion following an aspirin overdose has resulted in death. Aspirin acts on respiratory center and the medulla to increase respiratory rate and tidal volume. Okay, minute ventilation is determined by multiplying both. Okay, respiratory rate and tidal volume. So an increase in either can produce dramatic increase in minute ventilation, and resulting respiratory alkalosis traps salicylate ions in the blood, preventing them from continuing to cross into the CNS. Okay, that's why we do alkalosis, and respiratory alkalosis also acts on the same way. Okay, alkalosis traps the salicylate ions in the blood and prevent from continuing to cross into CNS, central nervous system. Clinicians should be aware of how airway management can exacerbate the condition of patients with salicylate poisoning. Okay, the brief period of apnea that occurs with sedation and paralysis performed in preparation for intubation can cause acute and substantial worsening of the patient's respiratory acidosis. During this period, salicylate ions become protonated with uncharged salicylic acid and diffuse across blood-brain barrier and increase toxicity. The high respiratory rate and minute ventilation observed in unintubated patients with salicylate poisoning is difficult to replicate with ventilator. Therefore, orotracheal intubation often causes relative hypoventilation, resulting in higher PCO2, than maintained by spontaneous ventilation, and possibly respiratory acidosis leading to increased toxicity. In addition, ventilatory asynchrony may decrease patient's ability to maintain appropriate acid-base homeostasis. So I think now you have understood why intubation is dangerous and should not be done. In general, intubation should be reserved for those patients with hypoventilation as determined by clinical evaluation or arterial blood gas analysis. Okay, when intubation should be necessary due to primary respiratory failure, maintaining high tidal volume and rapid respiratory rate becomes critically important. Ventilator settings should mimic the respiratory rate of the patient prior to intubation, and tidal volumes will likely not to exceed 6 to 8 ml per kg commonly used. Okay, so tidal volumes should be maintained in this range, not to exceed this range, unless there is ventilator patient asynchrony or a comparable problem making ventilation extremely difficult. Long acting neuromuscular blockade and deep sedation which blunt patient's ability to breathe over the ventilator should be avoided as much as possible. In addition, clinician must remain vigilant for auto PEP. Post, I meant to say that, what is the full form of PEP? Peak expiratory airway pressure. No, I forgot exactly the name of PEP, but I think you know PEP, which can prevent adequate ventilation. So clinician must remain vigilant for auto PEP, which can prevent adequate ventilation. Supplemental oxygen should be administered as needed, whether the patient is intubated or not. Okay, the presence of acute lung injury may lead to high oxygen requirement, and aspirin poisoned patients may be hypotensive due to insensible fluid loss and inappropriate systemic vasodilation. Aggressive volume resuscitation is warranted in such patients unless cerebral edema or pulmonary edema is present. Hypotensive patients who do not respond to fluid resuscitation can be treated with vasopressors such as phenylephrine or norepinephrine as appropriate. And talking about decontamination, activated charcoal effectively absorbs aspirin, and at least one initial dose should be given to all adult and cooperative patients and all intubated patients through orogastric tube who presents within 2 hours of ingestion. within 2 hours of ingestion. Okay, and activated charcoal should be avoided in any patient with altered mental status or increasing somnolence and unsecured, I mean to say that unsecured airway. Okay, because you have to secure airway before giving charcoal because it may cause aspiration. Okay, maintaining high minute ventilation will probably have a greater impact on clinical improvement than activated charcoal. Patients who present after 2 hours may benefit from acute charcoal because of delayed absorption due to enteric-coated tablets and pylorospasm or bezoar formation. So we can also give activated charcoal even if patient presents more than 2 hours of ingestion. So we have to consider the clinical scenario as well. Okay, and treatment with multiple dose activated charcoal result in lower salicylate levels in volunteers, and we suggest such treatment if it is tolerated. Okay, to prevent continued absorption, dosing is by 25 gram by mouth every 2 hours for 3 doses or 50 gram by mouth, okay, every 4 hours for 2 doses after the initial dose is given. Multiple dose activated charcoal should not be used in patients with poor gastric mobility or those in rare patients with salicylate induced gastrointestinal hemorrhage. Okay, in general, whole bowel irrigation is not routinely used for salicylate toxicity but can be considered for massive ingestion, entire bottles of tablet or sustained preparation or enteric coated drugs in an alert and cooperative patients. Okay, and aspirin toxication may decrease cerebral glucose concentrations despite a normal serum glucose. Thus, supplemental glucose should be given to patients with altered mental status regardless of serum glucose concentration. So let's write it down so that you won't forget. Supplemental glucose should be given to patients with altered mental status regardless of serum glucose concentration. Okay, serum glucose concentration. Okay, there are no clinical studies in humans which to base treatment recommendations for supplemental glucose in salicylate poisoning. One reasonable approach is to maintain patient serum glucose in the high normal range, approximately 80 to 120 mg per deciliter. In patients who are not able to eat, this can be accomplished using IV bolus of dextrose. Okay, or by adding 50 to 100 gram dextrose to each liter of maintenance fluid. In patients with any neurological deficits, including altered mental status, a serum or finger stick glucose concentration should be obtained every 1 to 2 hours until signs of severe toxicity resolve. Now let's talk about alkalinization of serum and urine. So alkalinization should be done, okay, with sodium bicarbonate. The usual initial dose of sodium bicarbonate is 1 to 2 milliequivalent per kg as intravenous bolus. Thus, this is followed by sodium bicarbonate infusion of 100 to 150 milliequivalent in 1 liter of sterile water with 5% dextrose. The rate of infusion is titrated to urine pH 7.5 to 8, but is usually 1.5 to 2 times the maintenance dose for intravenous fluids. Hypokalemia must be corrected or prevented for alkalinization to be effective. So I am again repeating it. I have already told you the mechanism. Hypokalemia must be corrected, okay, or prevented for alkalinization to be effective. Enteral or parenteral potassium supplement should be initiated even in patients with serum potassium concentration in the low normal range. Alkalinization will further lower serum potassium, and close monitoring of serum potassium hourly measurement is required during alkalinization therapy. Okay, so close monitoring of serum potassium, like even hourly measurement, is required during alkalinization therapy, as alkalinization will lower serum potassium. And discontinuation of urine alkalinization can occur when serum salicylate is less than 40 mg per deciliter, serum pH has normalized, okay, metabolic acidosis has resolved, okay, and patient is asymptomatic with normal respiratory rate and report. Arterial blood gas and serum salicylate level should continue to be checked every 1 to 2 hours, and urine pH every 4 hours. Urine pH every 4 hours after discontinuation for 2 to 4 hours to demonstrate resolution of toxicity. If serum and urine pH decrease, serum salicylate level increase. Metabolic acidosis returns or patient becomes symptomatic. Urine alkalinization should be restarted. So if serum and urine pH decrease, serum salicylate increase, metabolic acidosis returns or the patient becomes symptomatic, serum urine alkalinization should be restarted. To appreciate how alkalinization acts, it is important to note that salicylic acid is a weak acid. In the equilibrium reaction, let's say here H plus this is anion and this is unionized form, so there is equilibrium. If systemic pH is increased, the equation will move to left. If systemic pH is increased, the ensuing fall in plasma salicylic acid concentration will allow salicylic acid in the CNS and other tissue to diffuse into extracellular fluid down a favorable concentration gradient where it is trapped as salicylate ion. Okay, and the decrease in CNS salicylic acid concentration then causes the first equation to move to the right in the brain cell. Okay, first equation to move to the right in the brain cell. This increase in the cellular salicylic acid concentration promotes further drug movement out of the central nervous system. Okay, so did you understand or not? Decrease in CNS and salicylic acid concentration then causes the first equation to move to the right in the brain cell. Okay, and this increase in cellular salicylic acid concentration promotes further drug movement out of the central nervous system because cellular membrane is only crossed by uncharged salicylic acid. Alkalemia from respiratory alkalosis is not a contraindication to sodium bicarbonate therapy. So if you see, it is alkalemia. I am sorry, you are not seeing it. Alkalemia, now you may be seeing. Alkalemia is not a contraindication. If you see the patient has respiratory alkalosis and alkalemia, so it is not contraindication to sodium bicarbonate therapy. Aspirin poisoned patients commonly present with arterial pH between 7.5 to 7.55. These patients should be treated with sodium bicarbonate. Blood gas analysis every 2 to 4 hours is indicated. Okay, so blood gas analysis every 2 to 4 hours. Every 2 hours is indicated. Every 2 hours is indicated for monitoring to prevent severe alkalemia. And what is severe alkalemia? Arterial pH greater than 7.6. Urine pH 7.5 to 8 is desirable, although this may be difficult to obtain in salicylate poisoned patients, particularly in the setting of intravascular volume deficits and whole body potassium depletion. Concurrent alkalinization of the urine is also beneficial by increasing salicylate excretion. Since the salicylate anion is highly protein bound, it enters the urine primarily through secretion by the organic anion secretory pathway in the